Learning sciences is an interdisciplinary approach to studying learning that traditionally tries to combine the advantages of the experimental method with the reality of real learning settings like classrooms or lecture rooms or online learning. And the take that learning sciences has in particular is to study authentic learning in realistic situations and deal with the complexity of those. I think if you think of learning sciences as applied to student partnerships, it probably would mean actually introducing a bit more controlled element perhaps, because usually student partnership and peer-assisted learning research is done in authentic settings and in the wild, so to speak. And learning scientists typically add an element of experimental control. So one good example is studying the interaction between computer tutors and students, where the computer tutor tries to emulate a human peer. And that obviously can be done in sort of lab settings or laboratory-like settings rather than in the wild. What does that help us to do? It helps us to achieve one of the main goals of learning sciences, which is to, in addition to solving practical problems, to foster theory and to develop theory, advanced theory further. My own work in peer tutoring or the early work in peer tutoring, sort of conventional, is an extension of my work on self-explanation. So we studied for quite a while how people explain things, students explain things to themselves as they solve problems, and so they have an imagined peer perhaps. And what we found, this was in the context originally of physics problems, mechanics problem solving in American universities, undergraduate courses. We found that students who explain things to themselves and as they go through a worked example, like say, Newton's second law, to solve a problem with that law mathematically, that it actually improved their learning and their problem solving quite a bit, even so they didn't get any feedback from somebody other than themselves. And what we found there was that a key element is the quality of the explanations students generate for themselves. So if they try to come up with a deeper reasons for why an example solution shows certain things and does certain steps. And obviously that is an odd thing to do, to talk to yourself, even though we tend to do this quite often. A natural extension is, but also historically before that, was studying how people explain things, students explain things to peers, taking on the role of a tutor sometimes, hence having a bit of a knowledge advancement over the one that they are tutoring. And there again, as we know from more recent research on peer tutoring in particular, and the learning from teaching effect that is used as an explanation for the success of peer tutoring, it turns out that also in peer tutoring the quality of explanations is quite crucial. So that's a nice overlap with research on self-explanation, and also a nice overlap with research on learning from a computer tutor. What we observed recently when we looked at the research on peer tutoring and peer-assisted learning more general, which by the way is one of the most frequently used methods for learning to read in primary schools worldwide, that's often overlooked. That often I hear, or you hear, that peer-assisted learning, peer tutoring would be something that has a bit of a niche existence. Turns out in primary reading education, it's one of the main strategies. So pupils taking turns on talking to each other about what they understood from a text, and having the other listening and interrogating the understanding of the text by a peer. That's a very effective learning strategy. And at the same time, one of the big success stories of peer-assisted learning. So what we were recently sort of thinking was that looking across the research on peer-assisted learning, peer tutoring in particular, it tends in general to be helpful. It tends in general to have a average gain effect of 0.35 to 0.4, statistically speaking, effect size. So it helps, but this effect size typically would only be considered to be moderate in size. So what we were thinking is that's odd to some extent, because peer tutoring ticks all the boxes. It's constructive, it's active, it's social. It puts agency gives agency to the learners, etc., etc. So it should really be a stronger learning effect. And so what we try to sort of come up with is some two ways or two new key ideas to sort of get more out of peer tutoring. And the first element would be to use technology more aggressively, perhaps. It's a feature of peer-assisted learning, and that it doesn't use technology much. Most studies are still on the face-to-face, around the table, as we are talking now. If we were a peer tutoring team or pair or diet, but obviously technology can be used at least to make some of the logistics easier to arrange. So if students or learners meet online in a sort of web conference system, like Skype, everybody talks with Skype to their grandma, and grandpa, maybe they could also use that for learning and teaching. So technology certainly is there to make that happen. But in addition to just making it more logistically more easier to arrange for peer tutoring situations and settings, of course technology can also be used in other ways. For instance, it might now be possible for the tutor in the peer tutoring role to sort of look up things that he or she doesn't know the answer to while the communication is still going on. When you sit face to face with somebody, looking up something on a screen or so is a bit awkward, or it signals that you don't know. Of course, if you do this online, that can be done without interrupting the communication. Another affordance of web conferencing, even as simple as Skype, you can record those and you can reflect and come back to them. So even if the tutor doesn't have an answer in the immediate situation, he can sort of look at the video again of the conversation and answer additional questions, or answer them better than in the immediate give and take. The immediate give and take is important, research finds, but also creates certain constraints, obviously, in particular finding additional knowledge not available in the situation. So that's one element, just using technology, one of the not advanced technology, just standard technology, web conferencing in particular, a bit more widely and deeper. And the second idea, building on that, would be to turn around the relation between tutor and tutee in the form that we would suggest to have multiple tutors interacting with a single pupil or tutee. That sounds a bit odd in the real world, because it would be hard to arrange, but again, doing this online through web conferencing is rather straightforward, right? You just have more people in the conversation that take on the tutor role. Why do we think that is interesting? Well, and it sounds odd initially, right? So because typically we see the pupil/tutee learning, but of course the learning by teaching effect tells us that the tutors that are also learning. They are learning as much as the pupils, the tutee typically, and so there is a case to be made that multiple tutors could learn even more if they would work together with the pupil. Why would that be the case? Well, they can now discuss amongst each other questions that the pupil raised. They can discuss amongst each other what the likely cause is for underlying problems that the tutee faces. And they can discuss amongst each other what the best answer or reaction would be. And so they have to engage in decision making, in conversations. They have to do this maybe under time pressure, but again, using online technologies, we can, buffer the time, the reaction time, so they may have a bit more time to discuss before they react. And so this idea of having a team of tutors synchronous but also asynchronously helping a student in the tutee role is intriguing, at least on first sight. So we are proposing a research proposal and have submitted this recently to the Australian Research Council for considering for funding that looks exactly into that. And our expectations would be that we can double the effect size from 0.3 to 0.4 at least to 0.6 to 0.7, which would be really a strong learning effect now for the tutors, not only for the pupil. I think peer-assisted learning is mainly seen as a practical solution to certain problems that universities face. It can be quite big problems, such as the university as a for pay service provider is of course a model that's very much used in Australia, and England and America, but it's of course a model that also comes with challenges. So interestingly, it's in the British context and the UK context that the peer-assisted learning strategy has been proposed as a serious alternative to the service for pay model that dominates current business models of current universities education. And so it's basically a political and a pragmatic solution to various challenges. And having said this, what the learning sciences I think can bring to this is definitely also connecting it to things that are more theoretically motivated, such as the learning from teaching effect. But also we can look at motivational aspects of peer-assisted learning. So they are known to increase student engagement and motivation and so forth. And that's of course another challenge that universities face is student engagement, and one would hope for benefits there. And I think what can learning sciences? I mean, it shouldn't only be expert from learning sciences to peer-assisted learning practices. It should also be the other way around. So I think peer-assisted learning also offers interesting challenges for learning sciences. Because it's often done in universities, learning sciences are not so much focused on traditionally on higher learning and higher education. And so that may be an interesting impetus to extend our focus a bit from school learning to higher education learning. But in the learning sciences, we also have a lot of theorizing and empirical research that basically builds on models of social forms of learning, notions of agency and taking charge of one's knowledge advancement and learning are very prominent amongst learning scientists. And obviously peer-assisted learning is an interesting form of learning where agency is very much given to students and learners themselves. And so it plays potentially nicely into this more theoretical interest in epistemic agency, in relational agency, and in agency more general.